4:17 in the morning, and the satellite frame caught something that should not have been there. A Maxar Worldview 3 pass over the Vuhledar sector had been routine collection, scheduled, expected, filed. But the analyst pulling the imagery at a terminal somewhere west of the Dnipro stopped scrolling when she reached the southeastern quadrant. Lined up along the elevated coal haul road, partially obscured by the shadow of the embankment, were vehicle signatures. Thermal and optical both, not one or two. 19 distinct hulls with the angular silhouette of main battle tanks, and behind them a loose cluster of MTLB armored personnel carriers. Someone had assembled a battalion-level armored column on a raised mining causeway in the dark. On terrain where the ground on both sides dropped away into flooded subsidence pits, collapse craters left behind decades of coal extraction beneath the Donetsk steppe. The road was the only way forward, and it had been pre-registered by Ukrainian anti-tank planners since the previous autumn. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct exactly what happened to those 19 T-72B3 tanks, hour by hour, position by position, hit by hit. We will show you why Russian armored doctrine keeps feeding columns into terrain that offers no maneuver room. And we will show you the layered anti-tank system that was waiting for them. Because the story of Vuhledar is not a story of Ukrainian luck. It is a story of Russian predictability meeting Ukrainian preparation. The column was staged before dawn. By mid-morning, the causeway was a string of burning steel. How that happened, and why Russia did not learn from it, is what this investigation is about. The coal haul roads southeast of Vuhledar are not roads in any conventional military sense. They are elevated berms, raised embankments originally built to carry heavy mining convoys between the pits and the washing facilities at Vuhledar itself. The road surface sits anywhere from 2 to 4 meters above the surrounding terrain. On either side, the land has subsided over decades of underground mining, and those subsidence zones fill with water seasonally. By late winter, most of the low ground flanking the causeways hold standing water or mud with zero load-bearing capacity. A tank that tries to leave the road does not maneuver. It drowns. This geography is marked on every military map of the sector. It has been marked since Soviet cartographers updated the Donetsk region surveys in the 1980s. Any battalion commander preparing an advance through the Vuhledar corridor would have been handed a terrain assessment making the axis constraint explicit. The causeways are the only viable approach. There is no off-road option. There is no flanking maneuver. You go down the road, or you do not go. Vuhledar itself sits on a promontory, a low plateau above the surrounding flat terrain, about 240 meters above sea level, which gives it a commanding view of approaches from the south and southeast. Ukrainian forces had occupied and fortified the town since 2014, and the full-scale invasion beginning in February 2022 had not shifted that. Through 2022 and into 2023, Russian forces in the Donetsk direction had made repeated attempts on the southern axis, each time running into the same geographic problem. The town's elevated position and the flanking causeways created interlocking fields of observation and fire that were extremely difficult to suppress simultaneously. Russia had been assigning forces to the Vuhledar direction from multiple units. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, based in Vladivostok and transferred to the Donetsk front, had suffered severe losses in earlier attempts on the town. By early 2023, Ukrainian intelligence analysts assessed the formation's combat readiness as degraded to the point where offensive capacity was limited. But the Russian command structure was not withdrawing from the Axis. It was reinforcing it. Additional tank assets from the 150th Motorized Rifle Division had been fed into the sector. The operational logic appeared to be that sheer armored mass would eventually break through where finesse had failed. That logic was about to be tested against terrain it could not overcome. Here is the comparison that defined everything that followed. Russia had roughly 19 T-72B3 main battle tanks. a capable Soviet-era platform modernized with a new fire control system, improved reactive armor, and a 125mm smoothbore gun. Good tanks, not exceptional by contemporary standards, but sufficient for a breakthrough if the tactical situation allowed maneuver. Ukraine had no comparable tank mass in the immediate sector. What the Ukrainian brigade defending this axis had instead was a pre-registered kill zone, a minefield laid along the road verge during the preceding weeks, a section of anti-tank guided missile teams positioned in depth, and FPV drone operators who had been training on the exact terrain geometry they were about to work. Russia had the tanks, Ukraine had the architecture. That difference determined the outcome before the first engine turned over. The intelligence picture on the Ukrainian side had been building for approximately 72 hours before the assault. A forward observer attached to the 72nd Mechanized Brigade reported vehicle noise and thermal signatures consistent with tank movement in the staging area southeast of the town. Satellite imagery passes were tasked accordingly. The Maxar frame at Oro 417 confirmed the column in its staging position. A Ukrainian drone, a commercial Mavic type modified for reconnaissance, was sent over the staging area in the pre-dawn dark and returned imagery showing vehicles running their engines intermittently, a standard cold weather readiness practice that also made them thermally distinct on an infrared feed. Anti-tank planners at the brigade level had already war-gamed this axis. The southeastern Causeway network had been designated a priority interdiction zone the previous autumn, when Russian vehicle movement in that direction had first been detected at scale. The minefield laid along the verge of the primary causeway, approximately 1 kilometer from what analysts calculated to be the likely choke point where the road narrowed between two subsidence pools, had been placed with this approach in mind. Ukrainian engineers had worked at night to lay the mines without being detected by Russian observation posts further down the axis. With the column confirmed, the anti-tank section was activated. A tank destroyer element equipped with American-supplied Tau missile systems moved to pre-prepared fighting positions on elevated ground to the northwest of the causeway. Their firing solution had already been computed. The range to the choke point was just over 1,400 meters, within Tau's effective engagement envelope. The positions offered cover and concealment. The sight lines to the road were unobstructed. FPV drone teams, 3 operators from a unit that had been working the Vuhledar sector for several months, set up in a building on the town's southern edge. Their drones were loaded with modified warheads, RPG-type charges fitted to the quadcopter frames. Each drone cost roughly $400 to build. The column they were preparing to engage represented approximately $60 million in Russian military hardware at conservative replacement cost. The assault began at approximately 06:30 local time, with the first light of a gray winter morning providing just enough visibility for the column to move without lights. Russian doctrine for this kind of operation calls for the lead tank to advance, confirm the route, and allow follow-on elements to maintain close interval, a formation designed to maximize breakthrough speed once the lead vehicle has cleared obstacles. The lead T-72B3 moved along the causeway at reduced speed. It reached the choke point, the narrow stretch between the flooded subsidence craters, and the right track crossed the road verge into the mined area. The sequence happened fast. The mine triggered on the track, the detonation broke the right track run, and the tank stopped, partially slewed to the right, its main gun pointing across the subsidence pit rather than down the axis of advance. Immobilized, not destroyed. The crew was likely still alive, the hull intact, but stopped, blocking the road at exactly the geometry that made it impossible for vehicles behind to go around. The causeway was not wide enough to pass a 45-ton tank sitting crooked in the road. The second vehicle in column closed up to within 30 meters and then also stopped. The third vehicle was already committed to the causeway and could not reverse without backing into the fourth. And here is where the architecture paid off. The Ukrainian anti-tank section opened fire. The first Tau missile targeted the second tank in column, not the lead, which was already immobilized. The missile covered 1,400 meters in approximately 4 seconds and impacted at the junction between the turret ring and the upper hull front. The T-72B3's composite armor and explosive reactive armor tiles partially absorbed the penetrator, but the warhead generated sufficient internal overpressure to disable the fire control system and wound at least 2 crew members. The tank did not cook off immediately, but it was out of action. The third and fourth vehicles in the column now had no good options. The road behind them held more tanks. The road in front held 2 knocked-out hulls and a minefield of unknown extent. The subsidence craters on both sides held water deep enough to swallow a tank. Russian ground commanders faced a problem that Soviet armored doctrine, which emphasizes momentum and continuous advance, was poorly equipped to handle. A complete traffic stop at a prepared kill zone. A brief pause. The second Tau round was fired roughly 6 minutes after the first, targeting the fourth vehicle in the column. The calculation was that immobilizing the fourth tank would prevent any reverse movement by vehicles 2 and 3, trapping them in the kill zone between the lead casualties and the new blockage. The second missile hit was confirmed by drone imagery. The fourth tank shed its right track and came to rest against the road embankment. 3 of the 19 vehicles were stopped. The remaining 16 were strung along the causeway behind them, engines running, unable to advance, committed to a road with no exit. What followed over the next 40 minutes was methodical. We went through the OSINT record on this engagement carefully, and one detail kept returning: the consistency of the Russian radio traffic intercepted during the stalled assault. There was no confusion about what was happening. The crews knew they were in a kill zone. They knew the road was mined. What the intercepted communications show, filtered through Ukrainian signals intelligence reporting, is not panic, but a cascade of requests upward. Requests for artillery support to suppress the Ukrainian firing positions, requests for engineering assets to clear the road, requests for permission to reverse the column. Permission to reverse was apparently denied for a significant period. This is consistent with Russian command culture under the current operational framework, in which local commanders face severe consequences for unauthorized withdrawal. The crews were being held in the kill zone by orders while the Ukrainian fire teams worked through them. The FPV operators began their runs approximately 12 minutes after the first Tau strike, once the column had been confirmed stationary. The first drone targeted the engine deck of the second tank in column, already knocked out by the Tau, and impacted cleanly, triggering secondary ignition of the fuel in the rear hull. The tank began burning. That fire, clearly visible in drone footage later geolocated and confirmed by analysts at Oryx and several independent OSINT accounts, provided a targeting reference for subsequent strikes. The drone runs were not rapid fire in sequence. The operators worked with intervals, sending one drone, watching the result, assessing the column's response, then sending the next. This pacing was deliberate. Rushing would risk flying drones through their own smoke, degrading the operator's visual feed at the critical moment of impact. The spacing also made it harder for any Russian infantry accompanying the column to develop effective counter-drone positioning. Put yourself in the position of a Russian tank crew stopped on that causeway. You are in a 45-ton steel vehicle on a raised road with no exits. You can hear the Tau missiles being fired. They make a distinctive sound on launch. You can see the tanks ahead of you burning. You cannot go forward. Somewhere above you, a small quadcopter drone is making its final approach, and there is nothing you can do about it. The hatch is your only exit, and exiting under fire means standing on an open embankment. There is no good option. There was never a good option once the column entered the causeway. That is the point. By approximately 08:45 local time, Ukrainian drone footage and satellite imagery together show at least 7 T-72B3s burning or visibly disabled on the primary causeway. The remaining vehicles, OSINT estimates suggest between 8 and 11 intact tanks, plus several MTLBs, had halted and were attempting to create spacing to reduce the effectiveness of subsequent drone strikes. Some had begun firing their main guns in the general direction of suspected Ukrainian firing positions, an area suppression effort that reflected the absence of any specific target data. Here is the take that will probably generate disagreement. The failure at Vuhledar was not primarily a failure of Russian soldiers. The crews in those tanks were not incompetent. They were placed in an impossible tactical situation by commanders who committed armor to terrain that offered no maneuver and no surprise on an axis that Ukrainian planners had been anticipating and preparing for months. The real failure was in the decision cycle that approved this assault. 19 tanks on a causeway is not a plan. It is a queue. Artillery support for the stalled column was slow in arriving. When Russian indirect fire did begin falling in the sector, artillery and mortar directed at areas northwest of the causeway where Ukrainian positions were suspected, it was too diffuse to suppress the anti-tank teams. The Tau firing positions were well camouflaged, and the FPV operators were inside a building whose precise location was not known to Russian fire control. The counter-battery effort did not stop the Ukrainian fire. At some point between 09 hours and 09:30, Russian ground commanders appear to have received permission to withdraw the remaining functional vehicles. The MTLBs moved first in reverse back down the causeway, followed by whatever tanks could still move. The withdrawal itself took losses. At least 2 more vehicles were struck by FPV drones during the reverse movement, according to Ukrainian military sources and corroborating OSINT footage. By 10:00 hours local time, the causeway had cleared of moving Russian vehicles. What remained was a string of burned and damaged tanks occupying most of the road surface across roughly 800 meters. Drone footage taken in daylight showed the column as a series of blackened hulls at irregular intervals, some still smoking, one with its turret partially separated from the hull, the characteristic result of an ammunition cook-off. The subsidence craters on either side held water. The road was blocked. If you have been tracking this conflict seriously, the doctrine, the patterns, the equipment choices, this episode has specific implications that go beyond the immediate loss count. What kept happening at Vuhledar was the collision between a tactical system designed for breakthrough on open steppe and a defensive architecture specifically engineered to exploit the geographic constraints of the sector. Ukrainian battle damage assessment, corroborated by satellite imagery analyzed by several OSINT organizations, including those tracking the Oryx methodology equipment loss database, confirmed 15 T-72B3 main battle tanks either destroyed or damaged beyond field repair from the causeway engagement. An additional 3 vehicles were assessed as damaged but potentially recoverable, though given that they were left on or adjacent to a mined road under Ukrainian observation, recovery was not immediately attempted. 4 MTLBs were also confirmed destroyed. Russian mill blogger accounts, Telegram channels with documented connections to personnel in the Donetsk theater, acknowledged significant armored losses in the Vuhledar sector around this period, though the specific numbers were minimized. Several posts described the operation as having encountered unexpected mining and called for investigation of the planning process. The equipment value deserves a specific number. A T-72B3 in the modernized configuration deployed to the Donetsk theater costs Russia approximately $3 million per unit in procurement replacement terms. 15 confirmed destroyed represents roughly $45 million in main battle tank losses from a single morning's engagement on a single axis. The MTLBs add another 2 to 3 million. Personnel costs in any human accounting are beyond a monetary figure, but from a force generation perspective, each tank crew represents months of training time that the Russian military's manpower pipeline was already struggling to replace. Intercepted Russian communications from this period, fragments made available through Ukrainian military intelligence releases, and confirmed by several European signals analysis organizations, included traffic consistent with a significant loss event, requests for medical evacuation, reports of vehicle immobilization at grid coordinates matching the causeway, and later, internal communications expressing frustration about the planning process. One fragment, widely circulated in OSINT communities and attributed to communications within the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade's command element, described the approach road as a corridor with no exits. In context, that reads as an after-action assessment, not a warning. The warning had not been heeded before the assault. The strategic consequence of the causeway engagement was the stalling of the southeastern axis toward Vuhledar for several weeks. With the road physically blocked by burned hulls and the causeway verge's confirmed mined, any subsequent Russian advance on that axis required prior engineering work to clear the road and probe the mined areas, work that would itself be conducted under Ukrainian observation and fire. Russian forces did not immediately attempt another massed armor push on the same causeway. The engagement had effectively closed that axis until the physical evidence of the previous attempt could be cleared. Something about the Russian command's repeated commitment to this sector stays with me. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade had taken severe losses in earlier operations in the Vuhledar direction. The 150th Motorized Rifle Division assets fed into the sector had also bled. There is a point in military planning where the logic of sunk costs, we have already invested so much here we cannot abandon the axis, begins to substitute for rational assessment of tactical feasibility. The decision to send 19 tanks down a causeway that had been the site of previous costly failures looks, in retrospect, less like an operational plan and more like an institutional inability to accept that a particular axis was not going to work. The doctrine underpinning Russian armor employment in the Donetsk theater during this period reflected a fundamental mismatch between the tool and the terrain. Russian armored doctrine, developed for the European plain and refined for open steppe, assumes that massed armor creates shock effect through speed and volume, that if you put enough steel on a narrow front moving fast enough, the defender cannot respond effectively to all of it simultaneously. This is the logic of the Blitzkrieg and its Soviet successors. It requires maneuver room. It requires the ability to shift axes, exploit gaps, and prevent the defender from concentrating anti-tank fires on a single predictable line of advance. The Vuhledar terrain denied all of that. The causeways were not just constrained, they were predictable. Ukrainian planners did not need to guess which direction the armor would come from. The terrain made the decision for them. And once the Ukrainian anti-tank architecture was in place, the pre-registered firing solutions, the mined verge, the FPV teams, the Tau section, the engagement was not going to end differently regardless of how many tanks Russia committed to the axis. Here is what this tells us about Russian operational planning in the Donetsk theater at this stage of the war. The feedback loop was broken. Information about why previous attempts had failed was not producing changes in planning. Commanders who raised objections to assault plans were replaced or overruled. The institutional logic of the Russian military command, which prioritizes orders and continuous offensive pressure over tactical assessment, was generating repeated identical failures in identical terrain. This is not a small unit problem. Individual Russian soldiers were displaying considerable personal courage going into an engagement they could recognize as dangerous. The problem was structural. It was in the decisions made by people who were not on the causeway. Ukrainian doctrine, by contrast, demonstrated precisely the kind of adaptive layering that makes anti-tank defense exponentially more effective than any single weapon system. The pre-positioned mines created the initial immobilization without requiring any Ukrainian soldier to expose themselves. The Tau section provided precise long-range destruction once the column was stopped. The FPV teams handled follow-on strikes against vehicles that were stationary and unable to respond. Each layer fed into the next. The mines needed the tow section to exploit the immobilization before the Russian column could reorganize. The Tau section needed the mines to stop the column at a known firing position. The FPV teams needed both previous layers to have reduced the column's ability to maneuver or suppress. Remove any one layer, and the architecture loses its efficiency. This is the model that Ukrainian anti-tank planners had been developing across the Eastern Front since the early weeks of the full-scale invasion, refined through engagement after engagement. It performed exactly as designed against the most predictable axis in the Vuhledar sector. Will Russia change this? The evidence from the broader pattern of Donetsk operations suggests that tactical adaptation at the local level does occur. Russian forces have modified their approach to minefield breaching, changed their drone counter-tactics, altered infantry armor integration in some sectors. But the systematic commitment to terrain-independent armored assault in sectors where the geography forecloses maneuver has proven remarkably persistent. The institutional pressures that produce that commitment, the requirement to demonstrate offensive progress, the risk to commanders who propose axis changes, the logistics infrastructure already built for a specific direction, do not disappear because a battalion lost heavily. Ukrainian planners know this. The anti-tank architecture southeast of Vuhledar was not a one-time improvisation. It was a replicable system, and the Ukrainians knew it was going to be tested again on the same or adjacent axes. The question after the Causeway engagement was not whether Russia would come back, it was when, and whether the next attempt would show evidence that anyone in the Russian command had processed what happened on the road. Tell us in the comments, do you think the Russian command in this sector understood after the Causeway engagement why their plan had failed? Or do you think the lesson was buried in the reporting chain before it reached anyone who could change the doctrine? It is a genuine question, and there is evidence on both sides. The burned hulls on the Vuhledar Causeway were visible on commercial satellite imagery for weeks after the engagement. They were not quickly cleared. The road remained blocked. That persistence is itself a kind of documentation, the physical record of a decision that could not be undone, sitting on a raised road above flooded mining pits, visible from space. One detail from the OSINT record that stayed with me: in drone footage taken in the late morning hours after the Russian withdrawal, one of the T-72B3s on the Causeway had its engine deck still burning at low intensity several hours after the initial strikes. The tank's reactive armor tiles, the brick-like Contact 5 or relict packages mounted across the hull, had mostly blown off from the fire, leaving the base armor exposed. The turret was traversed to whatever angle it had been at when the crew abandoned or lost control. The gun was pointing out over one of the subsidence pits. Water in the pit was reflecting the gray morning sky. There was nothing for that gun to shoot at. Military historians studying tactical failures often look for the moment of doctrinal rigidity, the point where an institution kept doing the same thing and expected different results. Vuhledar offers a specific documented case study in that phenomenon. A similar pattern appeared in the Battle of the Bulge's final stages, when German armored columns committed to road-bound axes in the Ardennes found themselves channeled and destroyed by American tank destroyers and artillery using pre-registered fire. Terrain forced predictability. The defender exploited it. A different war, different systems, same geometry. Armor on a constrained route meeting a prepared kill zone. History has a way of presenting the same problem to armies that have not learned its previous lesson. Subscribe to Frontline Truth for weekly OSINT investigations like this one. Reconstruction of specific engagements, equipment analysis, and tactical assessments drawn from satellite imagery, drone footage, and open-source reporting. Each episode walks through a specific event with the detail that short news coverage cannot provide. The causeway southeast of Vuhledar is quiet now, at least compared to that morning. The terrain has not changed. The coal haul roads still run elevated above the subsidence craters. The geometry that made that axis a funnel in early 2023 is the same geometry it was in 2022, and the same it will be in any future operation in that sector. Terrain does not learn doctrine. Armies are supposed to. 3 questions to close on. Could Russia have avoided this outcome if it had committed engineering assets to probe the Causeway verge before committing the armor column? Almost certainly yes. A slower, more methodical approach with mine-clearing equipment would have degraded the effectiveness of the Ukrainian architecture, though it also would have taken more time and exposed the operation's intent more clearly. Second question. How does this engagement inform NATO's anti-tank doctrine as the alliance continues to integrate lessons from the Ukrainian front? The layered approach, terrain exploitation, pre-positioned mines, long-range precision-guided missiles, and close FPV strikes in sequence, is a template that several NATO armies are already studying formally. Third question. What comes next on this axis? Russian forces did not permanently abandon the Vuhledar direction after the Causeway engagement. The town remained a contested objective. Whether subsequent operations showed any evidence that the lesson of the burned column had changed Russian planning, that is the next investigation. The burned tanks on the Causeway are still in the satellite archive. The drone footage is preserved. The intercepted communications have been analyzed. The record is there for anyone willing to look at it carefully. That is what open-source investigation does. It takes what is visible and builds a picture that neither side can entirely suppress. 19 tanks lined up on a road with no exits. The flank was already zeroed, the rest was arithmetic.